Welcome to the Terry and Jesse show here on Virgin Most Powerful Radio. We have the honor of having Father Chad Ripperger with us, talking on spiritual warfare. And one of the big things is in 90 days, we're going to have an election. And we're talking about how a Catholic should vote with a Catholic mindset. So, Father Chad, welcome. And I'm putting you on the hot seat right away. What are your thoughts on how do we process voting as a Catholic properly?
Well, the church has always said that we have a duty as citizens of a particular country to actually to vote. We actually
Mhm.
have this duty to vote. There can be some things that can put that aside, but as a general rule, we have an obligation to actually vote. And so people will say, well, yeah, but right now we've got, for example, candidates who are not perfect. One actually holds stuff that's really evil, another guy that holds stuff that's also evil, but it's not as bad, etc. And so I don't want to vote for. And this is actually true even in relationship to other forms of legislation, because this discussion of this has been reiterated throughout the history of the church, all the way up even through John Paul II had actually talked about it. So but the basic principle is that in a situation like that, then your obligation is to vote for the lesser of two evils. And the reason being is because in the lesser of two evils, people say, well, you're voting for evil. No, you're actually not voting for evil. When you're voting for a lesser evil, you're not voting for the person's evil or for the evil that the thing is doing. What you're voting to is to preserve the good that would be lost if the other opponent got in who's more evil, or if the legislation got passed in which was actually even worse, or what have you. So the point is you're voting to preserve the good. And in that sense, it's a morally good act, and also if you don't do that, then you may be responsible if a more evil person gets in because of a failure on your part to vote, or the citizenry's to vote for the lesser of two evils, then it's the sin of negligence because you've actually let somebody who's more evil get into that particular thing. So we have an obligation to vote for the lesser of two evils in order to be able to mitigate the evil and the damage that's actually done, and that's our obligation. It's St. Thomas himself who began to really lay out the principle of the lesser two evils. It did occur before in moral theology, but from St. Thomas all the way until modern theology, it has been held that it's a legitimate principle and that there's no question in any moral theologian that I'm aware of that would ever question the legitimacy of this principle. And so, as I mentioned, from St. Thomas on, it's always been accepted because you're preserving the good that would otherwise be lost.
Thank you.
Well, here's a question really that a lot of people want to hear the distinctions. Uh, you came up along with your team, Kyle Clement and others. You guys came up with a model called Liber Christo. It's a four-phase protocol of healing and deliverance from diabolical affliction. There are other models out there that other people have come up with, charismatic models like Neil Lozano, who started and developed the Unbound Ministry, which is a charismatic model designed to help individuals free from diabolical affliction. You have Encounter Ministries, that's another charismatic model founded by Patrick Reese and Father Matthias Thelen. They focus also on a healing ministry from diabolical affliction. You also have Father Greg Bramlage. He's in Texas somewhere, I forget where. He has his own model of healing and deliverance. So there's at least four that I named there.
Yeah.
What's different for people that want to know, late Catholics, what would be the difference between the Liber Christo four-phase protocol of healing and deliverance from diabolical affliction from the other models that I just named?
Well, I think that there's three essential points that are different. The first is that our model stays in our lane. In other words, because as I talk about in my book in Dominion in the chapter on authority, it has a specific structure. And if you step outside the authority structure, that's when you see people get retaliated against diabolically. And so part of this is to make sure that lay people weren't doing things they weren't supposed to be doing, like casting demons out of other people or doing, and, people say, well, you can be a saint and do that. Yeah, that's like 1 in 10,000, solid, or not 1 in 10,000. It's like 1 in a million actually Catholics would ever do that or have that grace to be able to do that. They act like, well, anybody can do it if you're holy. Well, and that's not exactly how that works. So even when you see, like, for example, St. Catherine of Siena casting out a demon, it's precisely because God gives her the divine inspiration to do it. Now, some people get an emotional desire to do it, and they can't discern that with between that and what's authentically divine. But that all being said, so this keeps people within their lane. So it keeps them within the authority structure, and it keeps them protected. The second thing is, and this is one of the primary reasons that we did it, is it provides a diagnostic tool to where we can get a better read on what the person's spiritual state is, not just in relationship to the diabolic, but even to what their virtues and vices are, which means even if you liberate something, and this is something that even a priest recently, who's a good friend of mine, he's a very good priest, I think he does fairly decent work in deliverance work, but he doesn't follow this model. He just listens to people and then immediately proceeds to prayer, which is kind of the Roman model. He actually asked one of our priests, he says, I have a really high rate of recidivism. What do you guys? And he says, no. And he says, well, why not? And he says, well, we haven't had recidivism until once we started putting Liber Christo in place. And the reason being is because you can liberate someone of diabolic influence, but if they've got the bad habits of their vices and things that got the demon in there to begin with, that doesn't go away by praying over them. And so they end up committing those things and going right back to it. And then, for example, in relationship to Neil Lozano, I think it has to do with the fourth key. Ours is following the authority structure. And so we would not recommend, there's many things in his book that is very good, Unbound, but there's some things in there that are actually not accurate in relationship to the authority structure, which is primarily revolves around the fourth key and people praying over other people. So then the other one is preparing people by going through this process where they pray and they actually begin the process of driving the demon out in order to be able to get on their feet, build the virtue, get that interior discipline that's necessary to engage in the spiritual warfare, so that long term, they're actually living a Catholic faith, praying regularly, and they're doing what they need to do so that even after they're liberated, they're okay. And then the last one had to do with just sheer numbers. The reason we started it is because when we first started Liber Christo, I should say 3 years ago, we did which we started a little bit before that, but we started taking statistics, and 3 years ago, we had over 8,000 people contact us, 8,000 contacts. And we just simply can't vet all these. It's just purely impossible.
Yeah.
On the other hand, we don't want to leave them unprovided for. And so this begins, if they follow the Liber Christo method and do the 4 phase protocol, a vast majority, 98 to 95% of the people can self-liberate from lower levels of diabolic influence, and they don't need to see an exorcist. They don't need to go through that, and then they build a virtue in the process. So this was actually designed in order to get the numbers down to that was more manageable about those who actually truly need to see an exorcist and those who don't. But going back to these other methods, I think a lot of times these methods are approaching this in a manner that is either violating the rules that really govern the authority structure and things of that sort, or lay people are doing certain things. And a lot of times people who are doing this stuff say, well, I'm doing this stuff. I'm laying hands on people and there's no problem. I always ask them just one question: what's your family life like?
Yeah.
And the reason I ask that question is because demons have a very specific tactic. If they can't attack the person who is doing the deliverance, they move laterally in order to go after the person's family. And so, 80 to 90% of the time, these people's family lives are a disaster. And so that's one of the reasons why we just don't recommend it. So this is something it's an objective standard. It's something that fits the Catholic tradition. It helps people to build virtue and interior discipline, which gives them long-term success and ability to be able to combat the demons and drive them out.
Father, last question. St. Charles Borromeo, the model that he has, I haven't heard anything about that. Tell us why he's essential in what your approach to spiritual.
I have not studied his approach closely enough to really be able to say too much about it. That is something that I've been. It's in my stack. It's something
Okay.
I've got. In fact, I even bought some of his books recently, very expensive, but
Yeah.
because they haven't been printed in 400 years, 300 years.
Wow.
So I actually bought the books. They're 300 years old, but I haven't had a chance to get to that. So I'm sorry.
What type of model did Father Gabriel Amorth use you said is he used the Roman model. What is that?
Yeah. So the Roman model is basically where you sit the person down, you listen to their story, which is the model that I use because that's what I was trained in initially, but then just became undoable. But and it's not an unreasonable model if you have a fair lower number of people. It's just that we found that Liber Christo has a lot more long-term success. That's just our
Yeah.
experience. But
Right.
so basically, it's you sit down, you listen to the person. If their story sounds authentic, then you pray over them and see what happens, right? And so the real difficulty though with that model is that you can pray over people, and I've had this. I'll give you just a couple of examples of why I think it's somewhat of a deficient model.
Mhm.
Is you'll pray over somebody, and then the person prayed or naturally manifests. So then you get the faculties, you start doing solemn exorcism, and then you've asked them all sorts of questions, and nothing really comes up, and then you get 3, 4, 5, 6 months into praying with this guy, and then he says, "Oh, Father, I forgot to tell you, by the way, I was a Satanist when I was younger."
Oh,
And you're like,
jeez.
that totally changes the whole dynamic. And so Liber Christo is designed to ferret all that stuff out, get that all cleaned up before. And so we've actually found people get liberated more quickly. Another difficulty is that with the Roman model is, and this is where the Liber Christo model I think is better because when people do the prayer prescription, there's going to be an objective pattern that's going to arise. Whereas with the Roman model, you have to take people at their face word. And a lot of times it's not that people are necessarily trying to lie to you or that type of thing, but a lot of times they desperately want help. So they'll say things that in order to get help from you. And so they kind of exaggerate things or they tell you things and just like, eh. And so it's a lot. As a model, I realize it's what's been done for centuries. But on the other hand, we think, and I'm not disparaging anybody who does it. I just think our model is better.
Got it
Got
from
it.
experience. Yep. Thank you very much, Father Ched. When we come back, we'll talk more on spiritual warfare here on Virgin Most Powerful Radio.